I would challenge utilities and companies in general to challenge their software suppliers and say, I need competitive advantages. I need to make sure I have a fully integrated environment that gives me the reports, that gives me the data, that gives me the um, competitive advantage in what I'm doing. So that might mean knowing all the suppliers that can supply me with a certain um, product or capability or service. And if there's anything we learned from COVID is supply chains are vulnerable. So having multiple and building on a network of suppliers, I think is key. And then being able to get competent recommendations on the different lenses you put on your suppliers. What's the, do I buy local? Do I get it shipped in? What's the carbon footprint of those suppliers?
Thanks so much for joining another edition of the never-ending climb for a stronger supply chain and companies running SAP. Today we have Martin Weisick. Martin is, needs very little introduction for most folks in the enterprise architecture community in SAP. Is the lead enterprise architect focused on large utilities. And if you are trying to figure out architecture for utilities, Martin's your guy. Martin, thank you so much for joining today.
Well, thank you for having me, Sean. It's great to be here and it's good to participate.
Amazing. So when we were talking about enterprise architecture, and one of the themes that is probably creating a little tension, especially for regulated industries like utilities, this concept of the ERP that they've implemented and invested in relative to this composable ERP concept. And there's a little bit of tension there. For the conversations you're having, what advice would you have for utilities and how they can think about enterprise architecture?
Well, Sean, that's a great question because it's a challenge for everyone, not just utilities, but utility specific, where there's stable operations that are consistent and things happen the same as they always have. But then there's also a part of the business that's growing and changing by leaps and bounds. And so they need a way of, keeping the lights on, literally, as well as then having this innovation aspect to their company and being able to move in different directions, like with electric vehicles and all of these demand response systems that they're creating, that's new to them. So this ability to have a composable ERP where you have certain parts of it that can be nimble and agile and growing and shrinking, and then a common piece, your finance department is stable and reliable, and then be able to flex out through third-party applications and industry cloud solutions. It all, is something that each company has and evaluates on an individual basis on how are they going to put assemble all these pieces together, throwing in a truckload of integration to make it all work between SAP and non-SAP products. And it is a challenge, and there's a logical way to think through it for companies and come up with the best solution that's optimized for their business and hopefully, meets the demands that their business has.
Yeah, I think that tension between the investment that they've put in so far and the way that investments need to be made, especially for industries that are highly regulated, that tension between CapEx and OpEx. And I know we've run into quite a few conversations where the OpEx conversation is not on the table right now for a variety of reasons. So whatever investments they're making have to be CapEx, and finding ways, we've been able to find several ways to help them do that. That for sure has been a big deal. I think the other piece is kind of that mindset around, yes, you've got the ERP system, and then there's the simple business technology platform, industry cloud add-ons that you can layer on with your ERP, but they also function as composable capabilities. I think we've seen more folks look out at things that they can buy before they go and try to build. I think there's a recognition that there's more folks that are alike than not.
And that's a good aspect of it, Sean. People are looking at flexing to the cloud. The cloud seems to be where people are trying to add their innovation. And that's where it speaks to some of the challenges or that tension where are you going to be able to capitalize that expense, or is it an expense to your organization? And then depending on what industry, and from a utility standpoint, a very capital intensive traditionally, and you've got all the regulators that weigh in on how and how will they let the utilities have that return on investment for cloud investments. And so there are ways and challenges with regulators on, but it's a recognition that they do have to change because a lot of that innovation is moving to the cloud. And for a lot of people, that means, letting go of your data and having it exist where it might not be on premise, where you can touch, feel, and see it. That data is now in the cloud, and with that comes a host of regulatory requirements and security and trust. And so, really, a lot of those things people need to change their and realize that to go forward in that environment, they need to appreciate how it works and how are they going to capitalize or expense it, and take care of those business facing things, because they have to stay in business and find out ways where they can accelerate or be innovative for a competitive advantage in that space. So it's a challenge, but it's something that's not going away. It's only going to evolve further.
I think one of the terms that we heard recently is that the future doesn't fit in the containers of the past. And I know, that was Rashad. It's such a true statement. And there are so many leaders, and maybe they're a technical leader, or maybe there's somebody within the organization that still feels like, I need to hug my data. And when they do that, of course, that's the way it worked years gone by. But that means that they're stalled and they're not taking advantage of the new capability as it's being released. And I think that's probably one of the contrasts of this elevator, if you will, or this escalator, where if you do it now, you have landed, you're on a platform. But if you can get to a place where you do have that continuous stream of new capabilities, just like Office 365, which many folks have already adopted, then you can start to realize that for your ERP solutions as well. And I think that kind of, I think Timo describes it as the escalator, where the good new things just keep on coming. And that feels like the kind of reconciliation that the traditional business case model is a little harder to reconcile, because if the organization is used to going and building their business case based on those containers of the past, and here's the new platform that we will land on, as opposed to, hey, we're going to be on an escalator where there's new stuff coming all the time. It's not even an apples to oranges. It's like a steak to oranges. And one of them just has way more protein than the other. So I'd love to hear a little bit more from you from some of the leading organizations that you get to work with. How are you seeing them work through that ROI, CapEx, OpEx conversation to help overcome some of that? Or how are they overcoming some of the folks that still want to hug their data?
There's a number of different aspects to that, from a security infrastructure aspect to a legal and regulatory aspect, and knowing what it is and where that data is going to be used. I think are all important factors. And people do need to appreciate new models, but see where it gives them an advantage. So if I'm not looking after servers and infrastructure, make that someone else's challenge. I can then spend my resources and time on leveraging what are the outcomes for my data that I'm consuming or producing, and leverage that for business advantage. So it's really a redeployment. So if you're talking about new containers to put things in, it's how can I create these new containers and take advantage of them in new ways? Because there's things aren't going to slow down. I mean, the markets are not going to change and go backwards anytime soon. So people need to look at how can they show innovation, and for their shareholders as well. Their shareholders want reliability. They want the best deployment of capital and best use of resources to impact share prices as well. So those are all aspects, whether or not you're looking at it from a lens of technology or from a finance perspective. All these things come into play, and you need to make sure you're equipped to answer or respond to these questions, uh, because the questions are being asked, and if not by you, then by your competition. And that's what's a challenge for people: is how can I stay ahead of the competition or stay competitive? Uh, you can't, from a utilities perspective, you can't push everything on to the ratepayers. You need to make sure you've got optimized deployment of capital within your organization, um, and make effective use. So that could be application rationalization, and that might mean consolidating on fewer technologies. So you've got to have a strong platform to put in place that allows you to extend and leverage out across these different areas.
I think the platform piece is so important because when organizations are looking to be able to tack on one more add-on, one more component, or connect different pieces to make the overall puzzle work better, I feel like that, I mean, it really gets to the crux of strong enterprise architecture. So that platform, for companies running SAP, I think we keep seeing, hearing that that's building, extending, using business technology platform. So that's creating opportunities to bring in new capabilities like AI, which I think there's a lot of procurement teams that are starting to get good at using ChatGPT to help them generate RFPs. But there's also opportunities to use generative AI to help process some of the procurement or procurement pay overhead. I know one of our customers is now processing over 1.5 billion a year on our AI, our invoice automation solution that runs on BT. So what else can you do with AI? Can you share some of the early wins that you're seeing from utilities and how they can take AI to augment their team or to complement some of what they're already doing, even if it's just emerging use cases?
Well, and that's the key. Everyone's trying to come up with what is the killer use case for AI. And so with SAP, we've started with quite a few different use cases across from HR through to purchasing through to different areas of your business, from being able to automate and supplement and optimize, all these different capabilities we're looking at enhancing that people can take advantage of. So just like you could use generative AI to come up with different use cases within supply chain, generating RFP responses or RFPs in general, through to a HR where you're constantly publishing position requests and or creating content to attract people to apply for jobs within your organization. So there's all kinds of things like that. There's also uh, work management areas that you're always looking at. So when a utility worker arrives at a scene, AI can help them interpret visual images like a pole and what's on a pole or what's wrong with cross members on a pole, and how can I then take that image, recognize what's wrong with it, and then issue a work order to kind of automate that. That's a little bit future looking, but not too future looking. There's a lot that's happening with generative AI as it applies to image recognition, and then how to create and automate process flows and work, which then would boil down to making sure I have the parts in stock and then scheduling that work to be done, can all be part of generative AI in terms of generating those workflows and that automation that people are looking for. So there's multiple areas for utility to be able to consume the AI capabilities. Everyone's just trying to struggle with what's going to give me the most bang for my buck. So what's going to help out the most, to dive into it, and then be able to come up with these large language models and aspects of AI that are specific to those use cases to make sure you're providing accurate, trusted responses and data that comes out of that.
Free of hallucinations.
You do have to put trust in the system, and to do that, it needs to be reliable. It needs to be resilient. You need all of these um, aspects of AI that people are just working through. So it's early days, but it's never going to get worse than it is now. It's only going to move forward and get better. So I think it's encouraging that there's all these new containers to put things in as we look to the future as well.
Yeah, 100%, Martin. So, in terms of landing the plane, what would you want leaders in supply chain, procurement, accounts payable, IT at utilities? What would you want them to remember after our conversation here? Say 6 months later, what would you want them to remember to take away so they can consider the most important things to help them build a stronger supply chain procurement with a strong enterprise architecture around SAP?
Well, I would challenge utilities and companies in general to challenge their software suppliers and say, I need competitive advantages. I need to make sure I have a fully integrated environment that gives me the reports, that gives me the data, that gives me the um, competitive advantage in what I'm doing. So that might mean knowing all the suppliers that can supply me with a certain um, product or capability or service. And if there's anything we learned from COVID is supply chains are vulnerable. So having multiple and building on a network of suppliers, I think is key. And then being able to get competent recommendations on the different lenses you put on your suppliers. What's the, do I buy local? Do I get it shipped in? What's the carbon footprint of those suppliers and the products they're supplying? So, from a financial lens, from an environmental sustainability lens, you need systems and technology that will give you that information so you can make those decisions. Because you need to stay competitive, but that competitiveness comes at a cost and must have a benefit to proceed down that path. So I think those are all, I would say, demand that from your vendors and make sure they're working on that for you.
Amazing. Much gratitude, Martin. Thank you so much. Really appreciate you joining, sharing your experience and wisdom with all of the audience for a stronger supply chain, stronger procurement for companies running SAP. And if you're looking for number one add-on to go help with that, you know who to call. Thanks so much, everybody. Have an amazing
All
day.
right. Thanks, Sean.